Okay, well, it's 7 o'clock, so I'll call the meeting to order. The first thing on the agenda was reviewing the minutes of the last meeting, actually the last 2 meetings, and we're not ready to do that, so I'll defer that till the next meeting. Next up would be consideration, on the agenda is consideration of finishing the discussion and making a decision on Terry, which we continued the hearing at the last meeting to give him an opportunity to present additional information should he choose. I received an email from him today saying he isn't going to be at the meeting. So we really don't have anything more to go on. So I think we can move forward and deliberate and then make a decision.
Did his email ask for more time or anything, or just indicate he could not come?
Which case would that
not cover wasn't
That was the case that was.
2/10 of an acre.
I believe he's made an application to the selectmen again.
Okay. He was the one with the
Well, he says simply, I will not be able to attend tonight's
staircase.
meeting for personal reasons. Thanks anyway. So.
What does that mean? Does he have to reapply or something?
Well, I think we've continued the hearing, so I think we have to move forward unless we think we should not. One issue for both this here discussion and the subsequent one on Evans is for Jerry, who's a new member, to, I think, decide whether he should recuse himself or not.
If there's not going to be any further discussion, then I should recuse myself.
Well, certainly on Evans there'll be more discussion. But, okay, so for Terry then, the voting members, we only have one alternate here. So Gino, you're the alternate who vote on any decisions on Terry. I suppose the first, I will reopen the public hearing on Terry. First, I'll ask if there's anybody in the audience who has any comments or additional comments on that variance application. This is the Francis Road application. Okay. Hearing none. Ladies and gentlemen, what should we make our final decision?
If we make a final decision, he'll have 30 days to ask for
An appeal.
an appeal or a rehearing on the issue. So
But in doing so, he'd have to have some
New
convincing new evidence or
right.
an error in.
But that's what we asked him.
we asked him
for
for that
last
anyways.
time was, can you explain what's unique about that
Right.
piece of property? And he was going to, I thought, look at that with an understanding of what that means.
I think I'm just saying it doesn't close them off.
Yeah, so
It
that
just
would
puts
be-
a clock on
That
it.
would be doing.
Well, it does. I mean, we certainly have a higher threshold of sorts to move for a rehearing. And I'm also a little bit concerned with Jerry's comment about him apparently applying to do something with the selectmen.
Yeah.
If we make a decision, we won't be able to revisit that same question on that proposal that he signed.
He's coming back with a different thing.
He'd have to come back with something substantially, meaningfully different.
No.
Well, if he came back with information that he wanted to present in regard to why that piece of property is unique in relation to other properties, that wouldn't be additional information that we could consider for reviewing?
Well, we're given guidance that we shouldn't grant a rehearing simply because the applicant was originally ill-prepared and so forth. I mean, that.
It's not supposed to allow you to rack
It's
it,
the whole
ratchet
idea of
Yeah.
giving somebody a second bite.
Without understanding, without knowing why he's not here tonight. Why don't we just
Would it also be
continue?
inappropriate for him to request a rehearing in as much as he's not here to have a basis for a rehearing?
Well, he was here last month, but I think for the rehearing, he'd have to either have new evidence or some proof, some argument that we made an error in our judgment. And if it's new evidence that, reasonably one could have not expected to be able to be presented at the original hearing.
Well,
That's the whole second
well,
bite, that 2 bites of the
We
apple.
don't understand why he's not here.
He says personal reasons.
Yeah, so why don't couldn't we just continue it?
We could, I have no.
Give him the benefit of the doubt,
Yeah.
so reason
because
could be
who
a
knows,
Yeah, make
family
a motion to
emergency.
continue. And we can wait.
Okay. Any discussion on the motion to continue?
I'll second it. I think it's reasonable if we don't know what happened here.
And
Okay.
because he may not know all these ins and outs. of
Yeah, I
it.
mean, I don't want to, I would not want to have to make a decision with him thinking he can come back and make the same argument again.
Right.
Okay, all in favor of continuing to our next meeting, which I'm not, well, I guess I now have to schedule it, which will be the third Wednesday of July, which is
The 17th.
17th.
My basis of stating his application to the selectmen was that he was on the agenda for the selectmen.
Okay.
Okay. Do we need to vote?
Yes, we do need to vote. So all in favor of continuing the hearing, public hearing on on Terry to meeting on July 17th, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So that's 5-0. Okay. Next on the agenda is the Evans discussion. We received new material from Mr. Cargill. Everybody's seen it. Again, and so it is new material and a new argument. Jerry, again, do you feel, I mean, it's your decision to recuse or not recuse.
Well, if there's going to be discussion tonight, I'll take part in that. I was at the meeting, so I listened to what the discussion was, and I've read all the minutes and viewed the tape.
And I think we are going to have, I mean, I think there's substantially different information, so,
I've read it.
okay. Why don't I first turn on the light, maybe you can see the
Yeah.
better.
As I understand it, you continued the public comment session.
Well, we're continuing the public hearing, which gives Ken and David and others in the audience time to present new information, rebut that information, further discussion. And then we may, then at the conclusion of that, decide to make a decision or decide we need more information or whatever. But, so this is the same public hearing, we've not re-noticed or anything, we simply notified at the last meeting that the prior hearing is continued. So I will reopen the hearing on the appeal of a denial of a building permit by the Edith Evans Trust, and invite Ken to, and you're welcome to get a chair so you don't have to stand up.
I sit 10 hours a day.
Okay, so do we all.
So pace around in circles. I just brought, there's 5 hard copies in here, full-size plan, 5 reduced plans.
Oh, great.
If you folks want to have it, I know that we sent that by email, and I thought I'd bring that along.
And I also printed out 2 copies of the small plan.
Yeah, there should be a small print also with copies of David Evans'. So there's a plan that each of you can have in front of you. So what we did after last meeting, I didn't have a real good schematic of just to put things in perspective. So we hired a surveyor to go up and draw a plat of the lot, which is scaled. If you had a full-size version, it's 1 inch, it's 30 feet, 1/30 scale. What I wanted to, I'm going to start at the back of my little memorandum and work my way forward, because some of the information at the back kind of serves as a good foundation for the waiver position that we're taking. you'll recall at the last meeting, I brought up the idea that this law is grandfathered. And that appeared to contradict the section of the statute which says that this statute applies to all existing lots. In fact, I can read that. And this section shall supersede any less stringent local ordinance, code, or regulation, and no existing law of tract of land shall be exempted from the provisions of this section, except in accordance with procedures set forth in this section. So that at first blush is all right, no grandfather, all right? And I was sort of put back on my heels, like, and I couldn't react to that well last meeting. And when I went back to my office and I started thinking about it, I think I understood what happens is almost everybody thinks of grandfathering in the context of municipal ordinances, zoning ordinances, and subdivision regulations. Okay? Because the vast majority of land use regulation in New Hampshire, if I had to put percentages, 95% of it is at the local and municipal level. There isn't very much in the way of land use regulation at the state level unless we're talking about a gravel pit, is one example. Most towns are familiar with. And another example is the statutes. There's very little land use regulation at the state level. So most people, I don't think, that the concept of grandfather doesn't leap into their head when we're dealing with state statute. Okay? But grandfathering is a matter of constitutional law, which means it is the highest form of law in the state, if you will. It takes precedence over everything else. And I think that was somewhat lost at the last meeting. Reading from the existing constitutional law of the state, it says grandfathered rights being defined as those rights that existed prior to the subsequent adoption of, and the key word here is statutes and or ordinances. So the Supreme Court is saying that the concept of grandfathering gives landowners a vested right for uses that existed prior to the adoption of a statute, RSA 674-41, or an ordinance, which would be the town ordinance. I'm not worried about a town ordinance here, I'm worried about the state statute. Okay? The law continues, the right to continue a non-conforming use is a vested right secured not only by statute, which is by state statute, but also Part 1, Articles 2 and 12 of the New Hampshire Constitution. Okay? And that concept of vested rights is so strong, what the law in New Hampshire is that where the right is oppressed by the public and the public welfare is only enhanced to a slight degree, that new statute is void as to that law. It's just void. And that's the concept that carries forward to the section on waivers from 674-41 to read through the section. So if we're talking grandfathering, this lot was purchased by David's parents in 1959. The first bridge was built, and there's an affidavit in the file, during 1960. That was a bridge on stone abutments with wood stringers. That bridge was then rebuilt with the current structure in 1968, excuse me. I think I have my date wrong, let me look. It was 1968 that the bridge was reconstructed in its current configuration, which is a poured concrete abutments, steel stringers, and a cast concrete surface. So it was built in 1968. So this lot and the configuration you're seeing on that plan, with the driveway and the bridge, has been in continuous existence since 1960, been in continuous existence with the bridge in its current form since 1969. The driveway's always been there. There had historically been a summer residence on the property, so there's always had residential use. And
That was a trailer, though, wasn't it?
it's a trailer
Okay.
for the summer. Okay? It has always been taxed as residential property by the town of Jackson from 1959 forward. Now the statute, RSA 674-41, was first adopted in 1983. So if we're looking at the 1968 reconstruction of that bridge, it existed some 15 years before the adoption of RSA 674-41. That driveway was used to access the lot, used for seasonal residential purposes. As originally adopted, the New Hampshire Supreme Court held that RSA 674-41 did not, if you had frontage via an easement, it was okay under the statute. Okay. The legislature then changed that, and I know why and when they changed it, in 1995, which followed the last economic downturn. If you remember, the economy collapsed here in the late 80s. The real estate market went to hell in a handbasket in the early 90s, and there were a lot of unfinished roads at that era. So the legislature went back and they amended 674-41 to discount or disqualify frontage via a street or right of way. So if you look at the 95 amendments, that's really what we're talking about here. We are close to 30 years after installation, 27 years after installation of the bridge in its current format. Okay? So right there, I'm very confident that if we had taken this up with grandfather for the use that we've got.
Well, that, isn't that the issue, is what is being grandfathered, because there's, you're also proposing and changing the use from a camp to a full-time year-round house.
I don't have the case, but I can follow up later on to give you an example of what that use is. There's a case on grandfathered signage where the sign was ripped off the face of the building and the only thing sticking out was a stanchion like this. They went to put the sign on it. And the Supreme Court held that is enough of a sign to support the grandfathered use again.
No, I'm not questioning whether or not something's been abandoned. I'm questioning whether or not the use that existed was a summer camp, not a full-time year-round house.
I don't think that matters though, frankly, because
Still
even,
residential.
Well, no, but it's a change in use.
No, there's no distinction in your zoning ordinance or anywhere distinguishing seasonal residential use.
you can have a trailer on a piece of land and it's still, it's a home.
You're applying to the ZBA under part 2 of 674.
I raised 3 arguments
Okay.
the first time. One I'm moving away from because it's less than clear.
You're still
I won't
making,
take the fee.
you're still
It's not
making
clear.
application to the board under part 2 of
Yeah.
674.
I'm going to get there, okay? But
But
I'm
have you addressed part 1? Have you gone to the Board of Selectmen and or the Planning Board to seek redress from them?
yes, and they denied our building permit.
No, the building inspector denied your building permit.
Well, he's an agent of the municipal government. The select board is the executive branch of municipal government, and the building inspector works for that. So a rejection by the building inspector is a rejection by
Actually,
the
it is.
select.
Actually, it is. Under 674-41, part 1, you have the action toward to remedy this to both the planning board, who may plat it as a street, and you haven't gone to the planning board, and that's part 1, and or the selectmen.
But the selectmen also have to interface with the planning board and make a policy decision that
Correct.
to allow building on that street.
Right.
They've not done that. I think right now, all that's really in front of us is the only decision we have to make is whether or not we can grant a waiver or not grant a waiver.
I understand that,
So-
but I was just wondering if he had addressed part 1.
Part 1 is, I can address it for next month, we get another long memorandum. Our building application to the town was our part 1 effort at getting a building permit.
Well, if part 1, if you haven't addressed it in part 1, it doesn't preclude you from coming forward and asking them in part 2.
2, right, exactly.
Actually, in a sense, it does.
It does?
How so?
Well, it says that, part 2, whenever the enforcement of the provisions of section would entail practical difficulty. In other words, the practical difficulty and unnecessary hardship comes when you have been denied by the planning board and or the board of selectmen.
We have been denied by the select.
You haven't.
Well,
The
I
the
beg to
building,
differ.
the building inspector, without discussing it with the board of selectmen or the planning board,
Well, no, I think the board of selectmen were very much involved in this decision.
actually,
I mean, it was
they
done.
didn't deny the board of selectmen.
Was that because they don't deny it any longer?
Well, actually, they haven't set the procedures for SBC yet, so they're sort of in a limbo. But he hasn't met the criteria of part 1, and he may choose not to.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering if you had.
The selection, and I think I can produce minutes, told the building inspector to write the letter, so I don't know how we get around it.
Well, why don't we, just in the interest of time, I mean, there are, you all understand there are other options for you to pursue. Let's keep focused on,
If it's
may keep our questions
whichever way you want to proceed.
focused on what we can and can't decide. So
Okay.
if you could continue,
All right.
and I'm sorry for interrupting you on the use
There are
question.
two bases to my appeal. One is the grandfathering part, which I think RSA 674-41 just doesn't apply because of that. You've got a vested grandfather right. And I go to that to illustrate the significance to the New Hampshire Supreme Court weighing the public benefit from depriving property owner right as against the relative hardship suffered by the property owner. Okay. Going to the appeal right, the statute, there are two parts to the appeal. First, do we qualify for the appeal? And then, if we qualify, do we satisfy the appeal requirements? Okay. And in order to qualify for the appeal, you have to demonstrate unnecessary hardship. Those are the words in the statute. Those are the exact words that the New Hampshire Supreme Court uses in variance cases. So that standard is very well set, okay? And unnecessary hardness is present when a zoning restriction, in this case we've got a statutory restriction, but it is a restriction, applied to the property interferes with reasonable use of the property. Right now this statute is preventing access to this lot for residential purposes. It's just under 3 acres. It's an area predominated by residential uses. And if you can't use it for residential purposes because of the statute, that is an interference. And it's a material interference with your use of the property. The statute also says you have to consider interference with use of the property within the context of that lot setting. Here we are in an area that's predominated along both sides of the street by residential properties. There's no fair and substantial relationship exists between the general purposes of the statute and the specific restriction on the property. Okay? So what are the general purposes of the statute? They're enumerated in the statute, okay? It's to prevent issuance of a building permit which would distort the official map. Wouldn't distort the official map because we're already on it in its present configuration.
Actually, we don't have.
We don't have that.
Your tax map is your official map.
I don't,
Not in that sense.
well, whatever, let's keep on going.
It doesn't distort, okay, whatever. Okay? It doesn't increase the difficulty of carrying out the master plan. I don't see how it has any impact on carrying out the master plan. You've got a lot within a residential neighborhood that's zoned residential, tax residential, doesn't pass a straight face test to say that that would interfere with implementation of the master plan. Okay, the next one is if erection of the building will not cause, if we go through and build something residentially, will that cause hardship to future purchasers? No, it's going to be a house like any other house in Jackson. Any other house served by a driveway.
There is an issue with the bridge. And with respect to who owns the bridge?
That's part of the easement, and that's maintained by them, so that's the Evans owned bridge.
But it's,
Who owns the bridge?
The people who use it, it's their easement, it's their bridge.
Who accepts the liability for the bridge?
Oh, that's definitely with the Evans, there's no question about that.
definitely with whom?
The Evans Trust.
It's on their property.
And
Well,
is,
it's also on,
and is there
these property.
someone here tonight that can speak to the construction of the bridge and its ability to meet requirements?
Okay, I first of all, I looked hard through the zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations, and I find no driveway construction standards. If we're gonna get into that bridge,
Did you look at the road and driveway
We do have,
standards?
road and driveway standards, but I don't see anything about
Nothing in a bridge.
specific bridges,
I
culverts.
don't know,
I mean,
just
if we're gonna get into that, then every driveway with a culvert, every turn radius it's every elevation, every grade cut, every bank, every
Well,
drain.
that's not entirely true. The bridge is a bridge. If, for example, an excavator weighing 40 to 50,000 pounds on a trailer was going across that bridge, and the bridge failed, and the excavator ended up in the stream, pouring diesel fuel into the stream, who's liable, and what insurance company covers it?
That would be the property owner's liability and the general contractor.
At the very least, I would suggest that the town engineer, the building inspector, and the fire chief would inspect and approve the bridge.
Well, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit.
I mean, he was speaking about future purchase.
No, and I think I think that's a legitimate question, and we certainly, if we choose to grant a waiver, certainly
Exception.
can grant conditions to that waiver, which,
Right.
you know, may well include.
But I was concerned that his answer as to who owned the bridge.
Yes. Well, I wonder if since a portion of the bridge is on the Davis's property, I think.
They've got an easement for that portion.
Which we have an easement.
No, but it's real property. I mean, it's a structure on two pieces of
We'll put it
land.
this
Who
way.
owns property on?
Here's the bridge, right? It spans the river.
Yep.
The property line is the center line of the brook.
So it doesn't,
The
don't,
owner of the easement is the only person who owns both sides, rights to both sides of that brook.
no, but, no, interesting question whether on
Are
Davis.
you asking if having an easement on a piece of property is tantamount to ownership?
No, I'm asking, I guess I'm asking the question, and I think Jerry was going the same place, since a piece of the bridge is on real property owned by the Davises, don't they own half the bridge? And
Which they've
Evans.
given.
They've given an easement to
in
travel
perpetuity.
over their property.
An easement is not a transfer of
That's
land.
what I'm asking,
Yes,
that's the
it is.
question you're
No, I'm
asking.
not asking about transfer of land, just,
If I read the easement, it says that the only rights to construct the driveway and the road belong to the owner of the easement. All right? The
Okay.
owners of the easements have the right to construct the road and build the driveway.
okay.
It's theirs
It's not an
exclusively.
easement, I gave him 30 feet, he's got 30 feet deeded, so it's not an easement, he owns the land. He owns the land, that the bridge is on both sides.
So he owns the bridge.
It's an easement.
That's theirs,
That's it.
they own the bridge and they own both sides of the brook.
You can get into the,
Okay,
all right?
let's keep on going.
If you read the easement deed, they have the right to construct, an obligation to maintain the bridge.
Okay.
There's no question, and if, you know, everybody can have this academic argument, but they own the bridge. Right. So back to where I left off was, will that cause hardship to a purchaser? No, I mean, any owner that buys property buys it with the maintenance burden, right? There are houses on steep hills with steep driveways. Yeah, does the owner of that have a hardship because the driveway's steep? Maybe, but they see that because they know they have to maintain it when they buy it. So this doesn't create any hardship beyond what any other homeowner acquires when they buy a house that's served by a driveway. There are other homes in this town that have bridges for driveways, culverts, turn radii, bank cuts, you name it. And will this have, and it says the keywords are an undue financial impact on the municipality. It won't be any, because the town has no obligation to maintain this bridge. Right? So those are the general purposes of the statute. And the question then is, will an exception
This is called an
frustrate any of those purposes? And I don't see how you can make a solid argument that it does. I'm of course biased, I'm representing my client, but if there's an objective answer, you know, if I could objectively look at that and see when I'd address it, all right? So that is prong one. Does this, getting back to my examples here. This was there's no fair and substantial relationship exists between the general purposes which are covered and the specific restriction on the property. You're not talking about generally the statute, but looking at the specific restriction. And I don't see a substantial relationship, and that's a word right out of the Supreme Court. Is there a substantial relationship between this specific driveway and the general purposes of the statute? No. Doesn't mean there's no relationship, but there certainly isn't a substantial relationship. Third one is, will deviation from the ordinance injure public or private rights of others? I don't see how that would happen. You know, once once again, the bridge has been there, it's been used in a residential setting, what rights, if any, would be injured? And it's not just a hypothetical, maybe a meteorite will hit the bridge type of thing. This has to be, there has to be a probability of an outcome, and I don't see something where there's a real probability. So the first step is, so having gone through those definitions, that means we've crossed the threshold of unnecessary hardship as defined by the New Hampshire Supreme Court. The next thing we have to demonstrate, it says, all right, cross that bridge, the unnecessary hardship, no pun intended.
Oh, yes, as you say.
Okay. And the next question is, as long as the structures have no relationship to proposed streets or roads. That's a new part of the section 95. And that's an interesting question, because bear in mind that streets in this statute are defined to not include the private right-of-way. So that means, if you read this literally, that if this building has any relationship to any street or road in Jackson, you lose your appeal right. And that's an absolutely absurd outcome. I took a look back at when this found its way into the ordinance, the statute, and it was during that 95 time frame. And that was, to give one example locally, the Stillings Branch subdivision in Bartlett. The RTC took over the bank failed, and a bridge reconstruction was bonded. And it was a major bridge crossing the river up there, okay? That was a proposed street, and every building on the other side of it had to be accessed by a bridge, which was substandard. Well, that's a fair and substantial relationship to a proposed street that would have invoked the statute, and that's why they were doing it, because in the early 90s they had lots of these huge subdivisions around with big proposed infrastructure that wasn't completed, and to build on the other side of that infrastructure was intended to be stopped by this, okay? But you can't read this so literally, like, gee whiz, they had to drive up, Black Mountain Road to get to the driveway, therefore there's a substantial relationship to the road, we can't do the appeal. You'd have to find some material correlation between a proposed road and this house, which there isn't any.
Or, well, I'm sorry, I don't want to digress, keep on going. I
Okay.
think there's some other arguments
So,
there, but go ahead.
You can make hypothetical arguments, but
Well, no, I think one argument I will make, or one just
Okay.
is that, perhaps that means that we have the ability to, the one that's been suggested in some of the materials we get, is that we might use this to approve a building permit to build a hunting camp or something that has no need to be connected to the street, but to approve a house, maybe it really should go to the planning board or to have the street platted and meet the town standards. Now, maybe there's something between, but I think, there are, at least depending on how you read which of the three ways you can address your problem, one could, I think, treat that very literally and end up with only agricultural purposes and hunting camps and so forth.
In fact, I think it's hard to show hardship until you've exhausted the planning board's route of platting the street. Because no hardship would exist if the planning board platted it.
Well,
Well,
that's
but
an
they-
interesting
they
discussion.
haven't, so there's a hardship that exists.
Well, no, there isn't,
Anyway,
because he hasn't
well,
tried.
I knew I shouldn't have asked that.
Okay.
Let's just keep on continuing.
I just want to go back to that
Yes.
1 minute, okay? You don't have to prove unnecessary hardship by not going to the planning board and platting this as a town platted road, okay? It says, whenever the enforcement of the provisions of this section would entail practical difficulty, all right, or unnecessary hardship, and going back to plat a 60-foot wide right-of-way that you could land a jet on to serve one house is a practical difficulty and an unnecessary hardship, and there is no way any judge in New Hampshire would find other ways.
But your description of what the planning board would plat is inaccurate. Go ahead.
And more importantly, just disagree that we have to do that under the terms of the statute. And I'm happy to brief that at the next meeting if we have to do that.
Let's hope we don't.
All right. So, right now where I am is I've walked through the part of do we qualify to apply for an exception to enforcement, and I think that in my mind I've demonstrated that we have.
So your argument on, connection to existing or proposed streets is that, if I understand it, it's so onerous that it can't mean what it says.
Well, in New Hampshire, the rule is that you have to read statutes so as not to reach an absurd outcome. And if you read that absolutely literally, okay, it would render impossible any appeal, because every building that somehow, at some level, are related to a street or a proposed road.
But, excuse me, but then by that argument, everything qualifies. What would not qualify?
The example I gave of Stillings Grant, where you have a
Okay.
large subdivision
Okay.
served by a
Thank you.
platted bridge that's
No,
not
I
substantial.
understand your argument now. Thank
There's a
you.
material and substantial connection there where we don't have
Okay.
it here, okay? And once again, that was, I went back to the history of this, when that section was adopted was in the early to mid-90s. You know, bear in mind, things don't get through the legislature overnight. The problems are in the early 90s and they start.
I understand your
legislatively
argument.
correcting it. So it was for a different situation. In fact, on that interpretation issue, there was one case I found that I felt was similar to this. There's a statute out there which says that if a lot straddles town lines, it has to comply with the zoning ordinances of both communities. Okay? And there was a case where one community was zoned, I forget the exact numbers, but like 5-acre residential. And the other side was zoned, because a major thoroughfare went by there, was zoned for very intense use. And the developer applied to have, and this is a case where over 90% of the lot was located on the intense development side of the town line, okay? The folks from the other town opposed that application, said, wait a minute, this statute says you have to apply with the zoning ordinance of both towns, therefore, the 80% that's in the intense area has to be developed with 5-acre lots following our town zoning ordinance. And the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, that's a ridiculous outcome. We aren't going to apply a statute where you've got 20% of a lot in one town, so that town's ordinance supersedes the one next door. And they did a dividing line to get the common sense outcome. And that, to me, is somewhat similar to this related to roads situation. That's what it says, but it doesn't mean that you reach out for some marginal connection to a road somewhere and say, ah, you can't take an appeal. And it does not open the door to all appeals. Right. So once we've qualified to submit the appeal, the question is, the exception is permitted if the exception will not tend to distort, these words here again, will not tend to distort the official map. It won't. Increase the difficulty of carrying out the master plan. It won't. Cause unnecessary hardship to future purchases, no more so than any other household responsibility. And an undue financial impact on the municipality, there is none. So I think that, you know, when we get to the exception, then we fall within the analysis.
I have a question.
Sure, ask. I could talk a lot, I'd rather be answering questions. To be honest with you.
This is just going to be never subdivided, correct?
Can't.
This isn't just no. Okay, so then what we're really talking about?
Well, why do they say that? Why can't it?
Well, that's one. It would a condition that this cannot be subdivided run afoul of what you're trying to do.
No, that would be fine. I can't
The
imagine.
reason I'm asking is because there's a question of whether this belongs here at the planning board or at another forum. If this is something that could be subdivided, then I think it is appropriate to go to the planning.
We're not seeking
If they
to,
wanted
no
to
intention.
subdivide, they'd have to get,
They have to go to the planning board anyway.
That is definitely
To
before
the planning board, but we're just talking about a single-family home and a condition here,
Exactly.
not subdivided. I think we've narrowed the problem a little bit,
Yeah.
and that it would be something that could be part of our deliberations. So I wanted to clarify that. And did you take a look at the waiver for liability that for municipals on roads by chance?
I did not take a look at the waiver statute, but
Okay.
if we have to do that, we can.
Okay, I just,
Yeah. it's
that
not-
was
To make
another,
to make that a condition too.
as an
You can't
impact,
easily-
impact on the
It
municipality.
actually has to be made part of the deed.
Yes.
Exactly,
That's the way it's.
and that would help with the future buyers too, that they are aware of the conditions. I think one of the
Exactly.
impacts on future buyers was disclosure. And I know the deed on the easement is listed, but also any conditions we put
They go
on
on
this would go on too.
One of the things we could do, I mean, there's a lot of ways to do that, but subsequent deed out could contain a restriction, or you could grant the exception in recordable form with the restrictions in it.
That would, okay.
Exactly.
Okay, so that would be another way of addressing the issues, to get to where we want to get to. Those are helpful.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to see if B or others have any comments. Excuse me for that. Are there any other comments from abutters or testimony from abutters or other interested parties? Yes, Bob.
We've got an awful lot of situations just like this, and I hope that the next son of a gun comes in here, doesn't have such a hard time. The lot right next door, there's no frontage, and it's 3 acres of land, I guess. There's one right up the road, and talk about violations, we let this guy across the road build, he expanded his deck, he went up higher, Bissell's house, added another 50% of volume, and that goes right through. He has no frontage. There's a house that was built up on Reserve Road about 2 years ago, no frontage. Now, I don't see why you're picking on this one.
Well,
This like,
so I can.
We
I-
didn't
could
pick
I-
on it at all. They
No.
just denied the building permit, this is where they had to come.
They came to us after they were denied.
Well, so Bob, can I just for clarity, I can infer from that that you think we should grant a waiver for this, to allow this to happen?
Exception.
An exception.
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 Is that
Yes, I do,
grant
because
something.
Okay.
okay?
then again, you're in Jackson, it's how you spend your money. And the selectmen directed Andy to write that letter to the others.
Well, great. Are there other public comments? Okay, I'm going to suggest we deliberate. I think since there's at least a chance we may wish to receive some information from either the town engineer or the building inspector on how, with respect to our conditions that we might impose if we go forward with this, that it's best to continue the public hearing to allow that to happen if we have to. So I'm not going to close the public hearing.
You could make it conditional upon that, but I like the first way better.
So with that, we should, I guess, deliberate. And I think for out of completeness, we should at least consider the argument that was made last month that this is that the concept of denying the original argument that the appeal of the denial that somehow 674-41 doesn't apply here is something within our that was within our jurisdiction. I think we should at least make a decision that I would suggest the decision should be that we don't have any jurisdiction on that matter, and if Mr. Evans thinks that it's being misapplied, they should just take that up with the Superior Court. How do people feel about that?
I agree because Ken's got a great argument here. If everything Ken says is an accurate interpretation of what the Supreme Court's done, but you're asking us to, accept it. It's not that I think that you would mislead us in any way. It's just that,
A lawyer?
that's the way you see it.
So-
And you're explaining it to us, but you're representing the client. So it makes it very difficult unless we go on to get some kind of legal advice or confirmation. That's not-
And the reason I do this, I just don't want anybody to, since these arguments are made, I don't want anybody to think that we haven't addressed them.
I think, I kind of disagree with David that I think 674-41 Part 2 does allow ZBA to rule on this.
Well, I'm making the
I
argument
don't say
that,
it doesn't allow us to rule on it, I say it would be very difficult for us to rule
Well,
on the circumstances.
I'm not dealing with the request for a waiver. I'm addressing the argument of last month that we can decide whether or not the town is properly applying 674-41 in denying the permit. And I mean, the argument, as I understood it last month, was that we should somehow overturn the town's decision because they are misapplying or misconstruing 674.41. I don't think we have that standing to do that.
That's a good argument.
And I just want to kind of make sure that we at least address that.
Does that include the grandfathering issue?
No, I have not gotten to that yet.
So,
So that's, is there, have a motion for that?
so moved.
Okay.
Second.
And the motion is that we are taking the position that, you know, the argument of last month that somehow that we can rule on whether or not the town is properly applying 674.1 is not within our jurisdiction as a Board of Adjustment. Okay, it moved and seconded, all in favor? Aye, opposed, none.
Am I supposed to
5-0.
vote on this because?
No, Jerry is voting, so you're not voting.
Okay.
Jerry
I'm
did not,
affirmative.
yes. Okay, so now I think
To the
the
Exception.
principal issue is the exception. And I guess I'll start off by saying I think there's some merit to granting an exception. You know, my understanding of 674.1 is to prevent premature development and so forth. This is an area that is residential. I'm not sure I see the argument why residential can't be built here as long as the connection to the road and the over the easement meets whatever standards might be appropriate, and that might be a condition.
Can I mention something as even though I'm not voting? I think in this case, under that set of circumstances as they were presented, if this were to go to Superior Court, they would get exactly what they wanted and the town would lose.
So I guess I'm inclined to, I mean, my inclination is to, you know, without deliberating, that would be my direction, but after saying that, I think I should be quiet and see what other people's views are.
I think they've made the case for an exception without any question. I think they made the case. I think we've got the ability to put conditions on it. That's a good thing. But they certainly made the case for an exception to enforce it.
I would agree that an exception is in order, and I think there are a few conditions that we need to place on it. One being that it's clear that this will not be a subdivided lot, that they meet, and here I would like some feedback, is it driveway standards that are required by our zoning ordinance, which refers to state standards?
Well,
There may be,
Driveway standards,
there may be.
if it's not,
I don't remember what they are, but there may be a problem with that because they've only got 12 feet.
No,
think
I have,
that
I
driveway
have it with
Oh,
us.
do you?
I have it, I can share it with people, and when the time comes. I mean, but there are.
the easement says it's undetermined,
No, the easement says
30.
paved is 12.
The traveled way can be only 12
travel
feet,
way can only be 12 feet.
but there's no restriction on the width of the bridge.
What we do there is the travel surface is limited to 12 feet. But I don't fix the location because what happens if for some reason it has to move a little bit.
I just don't know what our standards is.
Okay, well, why don't, since Joan brought it up, I'll share this around, but I think the key aspects of the standards for driveways
For driveways.
would be that, first, it has to intersect at a 90-degree angle, plus or minus, I think, 15 degrees. There's certain widths that are necessary, anywhere from, I think, 10 to 15 or 12 to 15, and there has to be an apron, a paved apron, actually, that leads into the driveway that has a 10-foot radius. Now, I'll pass that along. You know, I think I'll add, Joan, that there's nothing on bridge construction, but we certainly, I would think that we'd want, if we went that direction, we would want to have some requirement that Burr or Andy approve the construction, and it'd certainly be big enough to handle a fire truck and oil tanker.
Find that there's something in the building code that addresses bridges.
Yeah, that probably is true.
Actually, well,
So
I
pass
would
it along.
recommend that a review by the town engineer, the building inspector, and the fire chief would be appropriate.
Yeah.
I just had
And
one
I think that
question.
with respect to road standards, if the planning board were to plat a street, both have the ability to waive standards in platting streets.
If this were a driveway, which is
It's just a
this is a driveway to me, because we've just gone over cannot be subdivided. So there's only one house being served
It's only
by
driveway.
this.
Okay, here's the driveway standards that pass around.
Just to add to bear in mind, where the intersection is the paved radius, that's within the town right of way, because you have 50-foot right of way and paved surface.
I understand.
So all that apron and so forth is within the town right of way, so it shouldn't be an issue.
No, and again, the idea is so a fire truck can pull into there and have it plowed and so forth. One issue we'd have to decide is, actually, let us continue talking, B. We'll get down to the detail of what we think is appropriate for a bridge.
Well, there's that, and there's also the applicability of a waiver of liability for the
Oh,
town.
we definitely have to require that, for sure.
So, I mean,
I think that's forgotten if we do anything.
But I don't think anyone here is technically skilled enough to define what is appropriate for the bridge.
No, I agree with you on that,
You
and I-
need the building inspector, town engineer, the fire chief.
but wouldn't they do that anyways for a driveway?
No.
No, so, and that's why I
And if it
think,
was just a driveway, we wouldn't be discussing this.
Yeah.
It's a bridge.
Graduate permit.
and I think that's why we can, I think, go as far as we can, maybe come up with some ideas about what we think, what we think the bridge standard should be, but then, if we're all agree with that,
The problem you're gonna get into is the bridge standards for what?
well, for a driveway.
Because someone can
For a
say,
driveway.
But that's not for us to determine.
Well, I think
problem.
we can we can certainly apply a condition that the bridge has to be, engineered to sufficiently carry, an oil truck or a fire pump or whatever.
I would leave that to the engineer.
Yeah.
Yes.
The building
Yeah,
inspector.
that's
fire
what I'm saying, that's all I'm suggesting is, and before we finalize it, if we move in that direction, that we at least get some input from Burr and Andy about how they think that condition might be phrased to meet their needs, but
And if there's any costs involved, would the applicant be subject to those costs?
cost involved for,
Engineering the bridge.
sure, it's their bridge.
Well, they're gonna have to engineer the bridge anyhow, we're not
Yeah.
engineering the bridge, all we'd be
No,
doing.
no,
is-
I'm saying if engineering was involved.
Yeah.
For example, Burr's expenses.
If the
So I'm
zoning
sorry.
ordinance say all driveways must be constructed to comply with the standards set by the state of New Hampshire
right,
and the town of Jackson.
And they're basically the same.
They are.
I've seen that.
Is this for driveway standards?
No, I
okay,
hear
right
you.
here.
Well, going around the room.
So we have three conditions: that lot not be subdivided. There's some sort of driveway and bridge standard to be met, and a waiver of municipal liability. Are there other conditions?
You recognize, I think the subdivision is a little unnecessary. That doesn't preclude a accessory apartment.
No, it doesn't.
No, it does not.
No.
That would be true of
That's not
any,
a subdivision.
that's not
Right,
subdivision.
that's what I'm saying. I think I mean, if you want to do it as a feel good, that's okay, but I don't see where it applies.
Well, they do it as a feel good, because
Because it can't be subdivided unless the planning board is involved.
It was just more so that this issue, the exceptions can come to us now
I
instead of
agree.
going to the zoning board at this point. I mean, get to the,
well, if they came, if they wanted to
Planning board
subdivide the
this
lot,
way.
and they came to the planning board with a plan that had a private road that met standards, I mean,
Then,
what would the
then
planning
in order
board
for
say?
that,
You
in
can't
order
do
for
that?
that to be valid, it would have to be part of the deed.
Yeah, and if they subdivide, all of a sudden they'd have different standards for that road, so
Yes, they'd
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
meet,
Right.
but if they met them, then they could.
probably,
but it's different from us starting out
Yes.
with those standards.
yes.
Right.
Well,
That's the other reason.
Brian and Jerry, you haven't really said much yet. On your views.
I agree with the direction that we're going and putting the conditions on it. Makes sense to me.
Jerry?
I am still of the opinion the proper route would be before the planning board. With that notwithstanding, I would not object to vote in the affirmative to grant the conditions of hardship and all that they claim exist, but I wouldn't do so until we had the proper authorities comment on the bridge. Because without the bridge, I don't see any issue here at all.
I agree. And that's why I, thinking we'd be going this direction, that's why I continued the hearing, so it's convenient to get the input of those individuals.
Not that it matters, but is this a use or a area variance? Or an exception?
I'm sorry?
It's an
This is an
exception under
exception.
the RS.
So it's an exception to an administrative.
Exception to enforcement.
This is before us as an appeal of administrative decision.
Right.
And which is the suggested way to bring a
I understand. That's-
exception to
that's why-
694.412 to
Right,
us.
that's how I was wondering with the wording exception. It's actually
Right.
an appeal to an administrative decision.
Yes. Well,
I would just like to give Evans a little bit more articulation of what we're looking for from the town engineer and the building inspector on this bridge.
We're
So we
looking-
don't drag this out.
We're looking for them to give us guidance in how to word the condition,
The condition.
I
And
think-
so that they'll be able to,
Some sort of statement as to who owns the bridge.
And it's for a driveway type
yeah,
bridge.
I mean, I think the issue more generally is these cases are before us because there's an issue of access to a public street.
Mhm.
And in granting an exception, we want to ensure that for both the town as well as future purchasers, that there's no I'm not sure, I'm not going to say hardship, but liability or issues. For example, we want to make sure, even though you'll be asked to sign a waiver of liability, we want to make sure that the fire engine can turn and get across that bridge, and not that we're worried about whether or not they can put out the fire in your house. We're more worried about our fire engine getting stuck on the bridge and falling in the river or something.
The suggestion is that,
But-
that you, it's part of a recorded restriction, that you can approve the exception to enforcement. And put on record is that prior to issuing a building permit, the applicant shall demonstrate to the town that the bridge is suitable for, fire trucks.
Except the applicant's not
Well,
an engineer.
Yeah, I think that,
Well, the applicant has to hire an engineer to do that, because,
do it.
what happens is a new owner's going to come in here, or in the house construction process, that's gonna have bearing on the bridge location, so you don't wanna get the cart ahead of the horse.
I think
so.
that Bob appropriately pointed out that this issue isn't gonna go away. And that possibly, when things keep coming up before the ZBA, it shows there's a flaw somewhere. And that possibly the planning board and or the selectmen should discuss how they want to treat this.
I agree. I mean, I think at this point, this is the second time we've faced this in the last couple of years. I think the ZBA is probably perfectly appropriate to deal with these on a one-off exception basis. But, once the town gains a little bit more understanding of the issues, it would be appropriate. I don't disagree that, having the selectmen or the planning board be involved, or actually both have.
Both.
They always have to be both.
Yes.
If the selectmen are involved, the planning board still has to be involved in setting policy on this. And honestly, there's a very big difference between this situation and somebody trying to build a house way up on the Class 6 road, way out of town. We might look at things very differently for that. And, to develop a policy at the planning board and selectmen, you might have to deal with all those possibilities. And, honestly, I'm not looking for business. I'm happy that we don't see any more 16.441s. But this one, it's, again, it's right in the middle of a residential area. I think we just have to make sure that, since we seem to be the only place in town and looking out for the town, which I think is one of the criteria we have to use. We just have to make sure that the access is appropriate for the intended use, and I think that inevitably means some standards for what that bridge is.
Yeah, we're not really appropriate for setting those standards.
No,
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 I
but I
think,
think
I
the suggestion
think,
is-
I'm only suggesting that we reach out to Burr and Andy, and maybe we can take a crack at what that language is, but then make sure that Andy and that language might be nothing more than a bridge that meets the reasonable specifications of the building inspector and the town engineer.
It would be wise for them to have their own structure.
But make sure that language is something that Andy and
Burfield.
Burr they're comfortable with, or make.
Yes.
Can I make a suggestion? This is somewhat typical of other problems, that if prior to issue of a building permit, the applicant has to deliver to the town an opinion from a licensed professional engineer indicating that the bridge is suitable for emergency vehicle traffic and routine.
We use that, we
That
use
doesn't
that,
preclude our engineer from.
no,
Yeah.
they have an engineer come
Have you
in.
applied for or received an E911 address?
What?
An E911 address?
Oh,
Emergency.
yes.
Yeah.
9/11.
You have. I mean.
Oh, for this lot, I don't know. I'm sure it's been numbered because it has an existing driveway permit, and that's how they do the E911 numbers, but there's no reason to know that.
Okay,
So
so,
raise my hand so I can speak. They usually have a structural engineer come in and look at it and make a statement on whether it's, it comports with all the regulations of the state and federal.
So still, if we're gonna
Excuse me?
write,
You're asking for the bridge to be examined.
As a
No.
town, yes, but I think it would suit you to have your own engineer look at it too.
well, let's keep a focus on what we're trying to do tonight.
so we need advice, I think, from Burr Phillips and Andy Chalmers as to how we should word the restriction, or what do we call this?
It's the exception, it's the
Condition-
conditions of
condition
permit.
approval.
It's a
How
conditional
we
exception.
should word the condition, so they're satisfied that they're gonna get the information they need in order to tell whether the bridge is adequate or inadequate.
Okay.
I don't think we can take a shot at that, I don't think we can
No,
figure it out,
no,
I don't think we can take a guess at it, and it will be easy.
But we're
They'll
not
tell you.
looking for the bridge has to have so much structural steel,
No,
We're just
no,
looking
but
for
how
generic.
they-
But I think what
How
David
they
is,
will get the information so that
Exactly.
they can tell that the bridge is ready.
Exactly.
Dave, why don't you make that motion?
I'll make that a motion.
So you want to continue this until next?
I
Mom.
do, yeah.
I think you have to.
If you state your motion, I'll second it.
I mean, I'm not comfortable with granting the exception and then saying, and, you know, everybody will have to show us this and show us that, because I don't know what they need to show
No,
us
no,
yet.
I think it's just, we say, I think we're in the direction of granting the exception with the conditions that it cannot be subdivided, that there be a municipal liability waiver signed,
Yep.
and that the bridge meets meet the reasonable standards of the town engineer
We don't-
and
I wouldn't
We
even
don't
say
have a
that.
standard.
What David's point is that we don't know how to say
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Okay, so, but
I wouldn't even say
maybe
that.
start that and then have Burr and Andy either come in next month or just comment in writing how they would want that changed or modified, or how they would suggest doing
And
it.
then why don't we grant our exception?
Is that close enough, or do you want to change that?
I guess
What are you saying?
that's okay, so what do you say, we grant the exception?
No,
No, we don't grant.
I don't think we can grant the exception has to, I think we can only grant the exception once we know precisely how we want to write the conditions.
That's what I
That's
Yes.
said.
the thing.
That's what I said.
And I'm suggesting, I'll be glad to reach out to Burr
Yeah. I
and
will get
Andy
all over
and
Andy.
describe what we're doing and ask them either to submit in writing or come here next month and
Right.
with suggested language
So
on
do
those
we need a
conditions.
motion to that effect?
Is that after they inspect it?
No,
That's
no.
before.
Okay, so they're gonna have a meeting next
They're gonna-
month and another
They're,
meeting after?
they're going to tell us how they think
Our condition.
our condition should be worded
Oh.
so that they'll get what they need. You know, when you start saying, you'll build a bridge that's reasonable for what you need it to do.
Oh, I know.
Well, then now you're in a fight.
Yeah,
And I suppose, do we
That's a
all
motion,
also want to include Jay in that, or not?
yeah, because he's fire chief, he's gonna have to bring a fire truck across it. the way he's-
Yeah, I would think
Fine.
her and Andy probably could take care of that, but sure, why not?
You get holes enough, Gino, we get there very.
Yeah, well, the question was, should we have Jay?
Yes.
Okay. We have a motion, has been
I'm
seconded.
not voting.
Do we really have a motion?
Yeah, we didn't have.
The motion is to
It was a
continue
long-
the hearing.
Okay, I just
Well,
want
no,
to
no,
make sure.
well, the
that-
It's a
motion
local
is-
motion.
Well, the motion is,
Well,
yeah,
that's
continue.
good, actually, a good point. Have we reached a conclusion and all we're worried about is language, so when we come back, we're just gonna be worrying about this one condition language, or are we gonna be back into rehearing and
I would-
deliberating?
Okay.
first?
I would let David define that.
I would
Okay.
ask,
I think, I like that defined.
may I ask, for the sake of the applicant, is that we have a motion to grant concession subject to conditions which will be considered at the next hearing.
Yes, I think that motion.
That way.
I think that would be fair, to be honest with you, that we
Well, how about,
close things a
Well,
little bit.
let's have David's motion.
Yeah.
yeah, or provisionally,
Okay.
or it's our sense of it that we will grant it. I mean, go ahead.
Okay, so I would make a motion that we grant the exception, subject to conditions, which we will have drafted at the next monthly meeting. And they will be drafted after discussion with Bert Phillips, Andy Chalmers, and Jay Henry in regard to the bridge, the road construction, and access by emergency vehicles.
I second
Can you, would you mind including in your conditions
Do we want-
also the subdivision and
Subdivision.
municipal liability?
That there'll be a condition of no subdivision allowed, and that they will sign a waiver of liability for the town, which will be recorded as part of the condition.
To that point of the subdivision, I don't think that would exclude us from making any other recommendations at the time of our vote. Or what-
I agree.
Okay,
So, will you second that, Jonathan? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And would you, so we have something to start with next week, next month, can I, unless somebody else is gonna volunteer, I'll be glad to start to try to write a decision.
Well, what I will do, because it may be helpful, I will put together a recordable form, a list of restrictions. You may add to edit, or do that, because I've done this many times before, including bridges and getting an engineer's certification before you build them. So
yeah, that's great.
We'll be happy for your suggestions.
So,
Yeah, absolutely.
you can be helpful, you can shred it, I don't care. I'll send that out in the next day or two.
Okay,
Any other business?
and then, so because we're also gonna receive we may receive additional testimony next month, I'm going to continue the public hearing to July 19th,
Wait a second.
Seven.
17th, at 7 o'clock at this time, and hopefully we'll get over that very quickly.
And will somebody notify the other fellow that we continued the hearing again, so that,
I will send an email.
and remind him
I'll remind him that,
we were
that
looking for?
and I'll also remind him that, once if we go forward as expected and deny it, the ability to
Yeah.
give new information is more limited than if he were to show up next month.
Right.
I also think next month we may well have a variance from Fritz, variance request. And we'll have to go through our minutes. So the public hearing then is, what's the word, continued? Can I have a vote on that?
Terry, you're speaking of?
No, on,
We already
Evans.
voted.
No, to continue the Evans public hearing to next month.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, any other I have no other business. Is there any other comment or business that anybody has? Welcome Jerry to his new role as a member of the board. And I love that. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor? Okay, we're done. Thank you all.